Death sentences are some of the most chilling punishments in human history. They carry a finality that leaves no room for reversal, no space for second chances. When most people think of executions, they imagine criminals in their physical prime or young offenders who were cut down before their lives had barely begun. But there is another, equally haunting reality. Some of the oldest men and women ever to live were still condemned to die. The idea that someone can survive decades, enduring wars, witnessing generations, raising families, or even shaping history, only to face the ultimate punishment at the twilight of their life, is almost unimaginable. And yet, across civilizations and centuries, the hand of justice has proven relentless. Age, it seems, is no shield against the gallows, the firing squad, the guillotine, or the cold needle of lethal injection. This is the story of the oldest death sentences of all time. Tonight, on Law and Crime Files, we examine the life, the choices, and the oldest death sentences of all time. Don't forget to like this video, share with friends, and subscribe. Human societies have always grappled with questions of punishment. Is it meant to deter crime, to rehabilitate, or simply to exact revenge? And when the crime is grave enough, murder, treason, blasphemy, or acts that shake the foundations of a community, the ultimate punishment has often been death. In most cultures, we might assume that age softens justice. The elderly are traditionally revered, symbols of wisdom, endurance, and survival. In many societies, reaching old age was itself seen as a sign of divine favor. To sentence an old person to death would seem cruel, almost unnatural. And yet, time and again, the record shows that when the law or the people demanded vengeance, even those who had lived long lives were not spared. There's something deeply symbolic about executing the elderly. Unlike the execution of a young person, which is often described as a tragedy of lost potential, the execution of the old strikes at the idea of closure. These individuals have lived long enough to accumulate experience, to perhaps repent or reform, and yet society still chose to strip them of their final years. In many cases, these executions were not about preventing future harm. After all, what could an 80-year-old prisoner realistically do? Instead, they were about symbolism. A message had to be sent. No matter who you are, no matter how old you've become, justice will find you. This isn't just a modern phenomenon. Ancient texts are filled with examples of elders who met their fate through execution. Some of the most famous names in history, including philosophers, kings, and generals, faced trial in their later years and were condemned to die. Think of Socrates, the philosopher who shaped Western thought, forced to drink poison at age 70. Think of Roman senators and emperors, often executed in their later years for acts of treason or conspiracy. Think of medieval monarchs, dethroned and condemned long after their power had waned. Fast forward to the modern world, and the story continues. From aging Nazi war criminals tried decades after World War II, to elderly killers who spent years evading justice, to men executed in their 80s in the United States, history has shown us that death sentences recognize no age. These stories are more than just historical curiosities. They force us to wrestle with uncomfortable questions. Should justice have an expiration date? Is it morally right to execute someone who is old and frail? Or does carrying out such sentences affirm the principle that no one is above the law no matter how many birthdays they've celebrated? By exploring the oldest death sentences of all time, we uncover not only individual stories of crime and punishment, but also the deeper truths about what societies value, fear, and demand in the name of justice. Over the course of history, we'll see that these sentences span the full sweep of human civilization, from ancient Athens, where the seeds of democracy were stained by the execution of one of its greatest thinkers, to the torture chambers of the Inquisition, where even gray-haired women accused of witchcraft were burned at the stake, to modern courtrooms, where aged men who once held power face justice decades after their crimes. These stories reveal one chilling reality. Age cannot save you from the death penalty. And so, we begin our journey through time, uncovering the lives and deaths of those who became some of the oldest condemned prisoners in history. From ancient philosophy to modern-day prisons, the thread is the same. When society demands the ultimate punishment, even the frailest shoulders cannot escape the weight of justice. To understand the oldest death sentences ever handed down, we must first step back, far back, into the ancient world. These were times when law and justice were not abstract ideas but living forces that shaped entire civilizations. Death sentences were not merely punishments. They were spectacles, rituals, and warnings to anyone who dared to step out of line. And surprisingly, many of those who faced the ultimate penalty were already well into old age. Perhaps the most famous execution of an elder in history is that of Socrates, the philosopher of Athens. At the age of 70, Socrates stood trial for 2 charges: corrupting the youth in impiety, disrespecting the gods of the city. Socrates had lived through decades of Athenian politics, wars, and cultural change. He was no soldier, no politician, no priest, but a thinker. His method of questioning authority, poking holes in traditional beliefs, and encouraging young men to challenge everything made him a threat in the eyes of the state. At his trial, Socrates could have begged for mercy. He could have played the role of the frail old man, pleading for a chance to live out his final years in peace. But that was not his way. Instead, he boldly defended his philosophy, declaring that the unexamined life is not worth living. The court sentenced him to death by drinking hemlock, a lethal poison. Surrounded by friends and students, Socrates calmly accepted his fate. Eyewitnesses recorded how he drank the poison, walked until his legs grew heavy, and then lay down as his body stiffened. He died without fear, becoming immortal not through survival but through the legacy of his ideas. Socrates' case remains one of the clearest examples that age offers no shield from the law. 70 years of life, wisdom, and respect could not outweigh the wrath of a society that demanded conformity. The Roman Empire was a place where executions were political theater. While gladiators and criminals often faced death in the arena, the powerful elite were not immune, even in their old age. Take the story of Lucius Aelius Sejanus, a Roman statesman and advisor to Emperor Tiberius. Though not yet elderly at the time of his execution in 31 AD, his fate set the stage for what many older senators would later face. Accusations of treason or conspiracy could bring death to anyone, regardless of years lived. A particularly striking case is that of Seneca the Younger, the philosopher and tutor to Emperor Nero. Seneca was in his 60s when Nero accused him of conspiracy in 65 AD. Rather than face a public execution, he was ordered to take his own life. In Roman fashion, he opened his veins in a hot bath, bleeding to death slowly and painfully. His writings on stoicism, endurance, control, and dignity in suffering became a chilling reflection of his own end. Other Roman figures, even older than Seneca, were dragged into trials and sentenced to death by decree. Old senators, stripped of their influence, were executed in their homes or forced to commit suicide to avoid public humiliation. For Rome, age was no excuse. In fact, it often made the spectacle greater. The fall of a respected elder proved that no one, no matter how venerable, was beyond the emperor's reach. Across the world in ancient China, executions of the elderly also played a symbolic role. The ruling dynasties often targeted scholars, philosophers, or officials who had lived long enough to become outspoken critics of the state. One of the most infamous purges took place during the reign of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Determined to unify thought as well as territory, he ordered the execution of many Confucian scholars, some of whom were elderly men who had devoted their entire lives to teaching and writing. These executions, though not always meticulously recorded by name and age, stand as examples of how societies sought to silence wisdom when it threatened power. To execute an elder scholar was not just punishment, it was the destruction of memory, tradition, and authority outside the throne. Even within ancient religious texts, we see references to elderly figures condemned to death. In the Hebrew Bible, elders of cities often participated in trials that demanded execution, sometimes even of their own peers. While the Old Testament contains accounts of stonings and capital punishment, historical Jewish tradition reveals that older individuals could still be sentenced to death if found guilty of crimes such as blasphemy, idolatry, or breaking covenant law. One striking tale preserved in apocryphal writings is that of Susanna, who was falsely accused by two elders. Though she herself was spared, the irony is sharp. Those elders, already advanced in years, were sentenced to death once their lies were exposed. The message is clear. Even the old, when guilty, could face ultimate judgment. In Egypt, where pharaohs ruled as gods, capital punishment was rare but highly symbolic. Old men, particularly priests or high officials, could find themselves facing death if accused of betraying the divine order. One recorded instance is the case of conspirators against Ramses III in the 12th century BC. While most of the plotters were executed swiftly, records show that even older members of the court, men who had served faithfully for decades, were not spared. Ancient papyrus documents describe them being forced to take their own lives, a death sentence that carried shame as well as finality. Looking across these ancient examples, a clear pattern emerges. Whether in Athens, Rome, China, Israel, or Egypt, the death of the elderly carried weight beyond the individual. These executions were not about stopping an old man from future crimes. They were about sending a message. To the people, no one is above the law. To the powerful, age does not protect you. To future generations, defy authority, and you too will face judgment. In a time when reaching old age was rare, executing the elderly was doubly shocking. It meant society was willing to take the life of someone who had survived famine, plague, and war, and still declare them unworthy of their final years. From Socrates' calm acceptance of poison in Athens, to Rome's forced suicides, to the silenced voices of Chinese scholars and Hebrew elders, the ancient world left no doubt. Death sentences could strike at any age. But the story does not end here. As centuries passed, the Middle Ages and the early modern world brought their own brutal spectacles, executions where even the gray-haired and frail were dragged before crowds, accused of witchcraft, heresy, or treason, and burned, hanged, or beheaded without mercy. In our next chapter, we'll explore the medieval and early modern executions of the elderly, where superstition and politics collided, and old age became no shield from the flames of judgment. The fall of Rome and the rise of medieval Europe ushered in a new age of justice, one steeped in religion, superstition, and absolute monarchy. In this world, trials were not only legal proceedings but often spectacles of faith and power. For the elderly, far from being spared, old age sometimes made them more vulnerable. Gray hair could make a person seem wise, yes, but it could also mark them as dangerous, heretical, or even supernatural. And so, countless men and women lived to see old age, only to die by fire, blade, or rope. The Inquisition, launched in the 12th century, sought to root out heresy across Catholic Europe. Age was no shield here. In fact, elderly individuals often fell under suspicion precisely because of their influence. Records from Spain, Italy, and France describe priests, scholars, and village elders brought before inquisitors. One particularly tragic case comes from Aragon in 1321, where an 80-year-old woman was accused of witchcraft and heresy. Despite her frailty, she was publicly burned at the stake, her death intended to demonstrate the Church's unflinching resolve. The Inquisition's punishment of older individuals had symbolic weight. To burn an elder was to declare that no age, no lifetime of service, no accumulation of years could outweigh the gravity of heresy. Though the famous martyr Joan of Arc herself was young when executed in 1431, what is less often remembered is that decades later, several of the elderly clergy who had condemned her were themselves sentenced. The Church eventually reversed its stance, declaring Joan innocent. In a cruel twist of fate, some of the older clerics who had presided over her trial faced disgrace, excommunication, and, in rare cases, symbolic death sentences. Even in their old age, they could not escape accountability for condemning a teenage girl. The witch hunts that swept across Europe from the 1400s to the 1600s disproportionately targeted the elderly, particularly women. In many small villages, the image of a witch was often that of an old woman, widowed, childless, and living alone. Her wrinkles, failing health, or unusual habits were twisted into evidence of pacts with the devil. Take the infamous Trier witch trials, 1581 to 1593, in Germany. Among the hundreds executed, many were elderly women, accused of bringing famine and disease. Witnesses reported gray-haired widows, some well into their 70s, being dragged before courts, tortured into confessions, and burned alive. One record tells of Elsbeth P., an old woman said to be over 70 years old, accused of summoning storms. Despite her frailty, she was executed. Her death a spectacle meant to cleanse the community of evil. In Scotland, too, elderly women bore the brunt. The North Berwick witch trials, 1590s, included multiple elderly defendants accused of cursing King James VI. Age offered them no mercy. The tragedy is clear. Those who had survived into old age, often with no one left to defend them, became the easiest scapegoats for communities desperate to explain their misfortunes. Not all elderly victims were accused of witchcraft or heresy. Some were high-ranking men whose age did not shield them from political downfall. Sir Walter Raleigh, famed explorer, writer, and courtier, had lived a life of adventure. By 1618, he was 66 years old, elderly by the standards of his time. Yet King James I of England, wary of his influence and his failed expedition against Spanish interests, revived an old charge of treason. Despite his years of service, Raleigh was sentenced to death. On the day of his beheading, eyewitnesses described him as calm, dignified, and unafraid. "Strike, man, strike," he urged the executioner, unwilling to appear weak even in old age. His death remains one of the most famous examples of an elderly statesman executed for politics. Perhaps one of the most chilling examples of delayed justice comes from the aftermath of the English Civil War. When King Charles I was executed in 1649, dozens of men had signed his death warrant. But in 1660, when the monarchy was restored under Charles II, the tables turned. The so-called regicides, those who had condemned the king, were hunted down. By this time, many were already old men. Take Thomas Harrison, executed at nearly 60, and others in their 60s and 70s who were hanged, drawn, and quartered for their role. These men had lived for over a decade with their decision, only to face the most brutal execution methods of the age in their later years. For the monarchy, it was not enough that they had grown frail. Their old age only made their deaths more symbolic, proof that vengeance could wait decades if needed. The Protestant Reformation and its Catholic counter-movement produced countless martyrs, some of them quite old. One striking figure is Michael Servetus, a theologian who challenged both Catholic and Protestant doctrine. At age 60, after years of study and publication, he was condemned by John Calvin's Geneva and burned at the stake in 1553. Eyewitnesses recorded that the flames rose slowly, prolonging his suffering. In England, elderly Catholic priests faced execution under Elizabeth I, and elderly Protestants under Mary I. In both cases, old age did not soften the sentence. On the contrary, the execution of older religious figures sent a clear message: faith outside the sanctioned order would not be tolerated, at any age. The Middle Ages and early modern era intensified the themes already present in the ancient world. Death sentences for the elderly were not about preventing future crime, but about making examples. In the Inquisition, old age could not outweigh charges of heresy. In the witch trials, being elderly often made you a prime suspect. In the political sphere, age did not excuse treason or rebellion. These executions were both punishments and public performances. Burning an old woman alive or beheading an aging statesman carried a message. Power demanded obedience, and no one, however aged, was untouchable. From the crackling fires of witch trials to the cold steel of the executioner's axe, the medieval and early modern eras revealed the harsh truth. Old age offered no protection when religion or politics demanded blood. But as the world moved into the modern age, executions of the elderly took on new dimensions. With the rise of nation-states, revolutions, and world wars, some of history's most chilling cases of elderly executions were yet to come. In the next chapter, we enter the 19th and 20th centuries, where aging criminals, revolutionaries, and war criminals alike would face the ultimate sentence, sometimes after decades of waiting. By the 19th century, the world was changing. Enlightenment ideals, revolutions, and modern legal systems began reshaping how justice was administered. Torture as a public spectacle declined, trials became more formalized, and the idea of human rights slowly emerged. And yet, the death sentence endured. Age, even in this era of reform, did not guarantee mercy. In fact, some of the most shocking executions of the 19th and 20th centuries involved individuals who had lived long lives, only to meet a violent end when justice finally caught up with them. The French Revolution, though rooted in ideals of liberty and equality, became one of the bloodiest episodes in European history. The guillotine, a symbol of swift and equal justice, claimed thousands of lives. Among them were many elderly aristocrats, clergy, and political leaders. One striking example is Madame du Barry, the mistress of Louis XV, executed in 1793 at the age of 50. Though not elderly by today's standards, in her era she was considered well beyond middle age. Even more haunting were the stories of nuns in their 70s and 80s marched to the scaffold for refusing to abandon their vows. The Revolution made no exceptions. Whether 18 or 80, if you were deemed an enemy of the Republic, the blade awaited you. These cases cemented the guillotine's reputation as a tool of blind, unrelenting justice. Across Europe, revolutions swept through in waves, 1830, 1848, and beyond. Old generals, politicians, and activists often found themselves condemned alongside their younger comrades. In Hungary, after the failed revolution of 1848, Austrian authorities executed several leaders who were already advanced in age. These men, gray-haired veterans of earlier wars, were hanged or shot as traitors. Their deaths served as a chilling reminder that rebellion had no retirement age. Similarly, in Italy, the Risorgimento, the struggle for unification, saw older revolutionaries executed by conservative regimes. Even after a lifetime of service, these men paid with their final years for daring to challenge the old order. Though not particularly old, Wooldridge's case is notable for the public reaction it caused. Executions in Victorian England were becoming rarer, and when elderly prisoners were sentenced, society often debated whether it was humane to hang someone who had lived so long. One famous instance was William Frederick Horry, who was executed in 1872 at the age of 42. But in the later 19th century, records show multiple men in their 60s, a very advanced age for the time, facing the gallows. Newspapers often highlighted their gray hair, frail bodies, and trembling steps to the scaffold. The spectacle of an old man's execution struck contemporaries as both tragic and necessary, reinforcing the idea that justice recognized no age. The 20th century's global conflicts produced some of the most infamous elderly death sentences in history. World War I ended with political upheaval, but it was after World War II that elderly defendants stood trial in unprecedented numbers. The Nuremberg trials, 1945-1946, brought leading Nazi officials to justice. While not all were elderly, several were in their 60s and 70s, ages at which most men would expect to retire peacefully. Instead, they faced death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, field marshal, was 64 when executed. Alfred Jodl, also 54, seemed younger but was considered a senior figure. Others, like Hermann Göring, though younger, were already physically deteriorating. Beyond Nuremberg, additional trials across Europe condemned aging Nazi collaborators, some already in their 70s. Meanwhile, in Japan, the Tokyo war crimes trials condemned leaders like Hideki Tojo, 63, and others, several of whom were well past middle age. Their advanced years did not shield them from the gallows. Long after the war, justice continued to hunt down Nazi criminals. Some were captured and tried decades later, when they were already elderly. Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, was captured in 1960 and executed in Israel in 1962 at the age of 56. While not yet elderly, his case set a precedent for prosecuting war crimes regardless of age. Others, like Anton Maloth, known as the executioner of Theresienstadt, lived freely for decades. He was finally imprisoned in Germany in 2001, at over 89 years old. Though he died before facing execution, his case illustrates how close some elderly men came to receiving death sentences late in life. The symbolism here was enormous. Even 50 years after the crimes, justice had no expiration date. Jumping into the very recent past, one of the most shocking modern cases is that of Walter Moody. Convicted of a 1989 bombing that killed a federal judge, Moody spent decades fighting his sentence. By the time the courts exhausted his appeals, he was 83 years old, frail, gray, and decades removed from his crime. Yet in 2018, the state of Alabama carried out his execution, making him the oldest person executed in modern U.S. history. The case raised difficult questions. What was the purpose of executing a man in his 80s? Was it retribution, deterrence, or simply the completion of justice long delayed? For Moody's victims, the answer was clear: closure at last. But for many observers, his case symbolized the cold persistence of the death penalty, a punishment that can wait as long as it needs to. The 19th and 20th centuries reveal a tension. Society was moving toward reform, yet the death penalty remained unflinching. Elderly defendants, whether aristocrats, revolutionaries, generals, or terrorists, discovered that justice did not soften with time. What's striking is the shift in symbolism. In ancient and medieval times, executing the old was about demonstrating authority. In the modern world, it became about delayed accountability. Crimes committed decades earlier could still demand the ultimate price. From the guillotine of revolutionary France to the gallows of Nuremberg, from the gray-haired rebels of 19th century Europe to Walter Moody in Alabama, one theme is undeniable. Age does not stop the executioner's hand. But the story is not over. As we move into the 21st century in contemporary cases, the death penalty continues to claim the lives of the elderly, sparking fierce debates about justice, morality, and mercy in our own time. As the 20th century ended and the 21st century began, the death penalty did not disappear. In fact, it continued to ensnare men and women who had already lived long lives. But in today's world, these executions come with new debates. Is it moral to execute someone who is frail, sick, or near death already? Should justice be tempered by mercy? Or is punishment still valid no matter how late it arrives? Modern cases of elderly death sentences are not only about crime and retribution, they're about society wrestling with what it means to carry out justice in the twilight of someone's life. We have already mentioned Walter Moody, but his case deserves deeper reflection because of its symbolic weight. Convicted of sending a mail bomb that killed a federal judge in 1989, Moody spent nearly 30 years on death row. By the time Alabama executed him in 2018, he was 83 years old, blind in one eye, and suffering from numerous health problems. Yet the state refused to halt the execution. Moody remains the oldest executed prisoner in modern U.S. history. His death sparked heated debate. Supporters of the execution said it was necessary to show that no one could escape justice, even decades later. Opponents argued it was cruel and unnecessary to kill an old man who posed no physical threat. This case, more than any other in recent decades, embodies the central question of elderly death sentences in modern times. Is justice about protecting society, or is it about ensuring accountability no matter the cost? Another landmark American case is Clarence Ray Allen, executed in California in 2006. Allen was convicted of ordering 3 murders while already in prison for a previous killing. By the time his appeals ran out, Allen was 76 years old, legally blind, wheelchair-bound, and suffering from diabetes and heart disease. He had survived a near-fatal heart attack just months before his scheduled execution. When the state carried out his lethal injection, many were stunned at the sight. An elderly, frail man, wheeled into the chamber, strapped down, and executed like a much younger, more dangerous criminal. Supporters argued that his crimes were too severe to forgive. Critics saw it as barbaric, pointing out that executing someone who could barely move turned the death penalty into something closer to ritual vengeance than public safety. In Texas, serial killer Carl Eugene Watts, known as the Sunday Morning Slasher, murdered dozens of women in the 1970s and 80s. Though he avoided execution during his prime years due to plea deals, he was later resentenced when more evidence came to light. By the time the courts revisited his case, Watts was already older and dying of prostate cancer. Though he ultimately passed away before his scheduled execution, his case shows how the justice system can chase a man even into his final days. Right now, dozens of elderly prisoners sit on death row in the U.S., some in their 70s or even 80s. For example, Oscar Smith, age 72, sentenced to death in Tennessee for a triple murder, has fought repeated execution dates. David Carpenter, known as the Trailside Killer, is now in his 90s on California's death row. Many others wait in prison cells where their age and failing health raise constant questions. Should executions go forward, or should natural death claim them first? In these cases, the symbolism is stark. Executing a 30-year-old killer is one thing. Executing an 80-year-old in a wheelchair is another. But for families of victims, closure often requires that the sentence be carried out, no matter how long it takes. The pursuit of justice for World War II war crimes continued into the 2000s. Several men in their 80s and 90s faced trial for crimes committed in the 1940s. For example, John Demjanjuk, accused of being a Nazi guard, faced trial in Germany in 2011 at the age of 91. Though sentenced, he died before execution could occur. Others, like Oscar Groening, known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, were convicted in their 90s. Though not sentenced to death, these trials illustrate society's determination to hold the elderly accountable for even decades-old crimes. If the death penalty had still been active in Germany, many of these men would have faced execution even in their advanced years. Their trials kept alive the global debate: does justice have an expiration date? Outside the West, executions of elderly individuals remain more common. In countries such as China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, advanced age rarely prevents the death penalty from being applied. In Iran, reports have surfaced of prisoners in their 70s being executed for crimes ranging from murder to drug trafficking. In China, the death penalty is applied broadly, and while official statistics are hidden, observers believe elderly defendants have been executed in high-profile corruption cases, sometimes in their 70s. In Saudi Arabia, executions by beheading continue regardless of age, particularly for crimes considered religiously severe. These cases rarely make global headlines, but highlight the fact that, in many parts of the world, old age carries no legal privilege when it comes to capital punishment. The modern era reveals something powerful about death sentences in old age. Unlike in the past, executions today are not meant to be spectacles of faith or monarchy. Instead, they are framed as the final fulfillment of justice, often delayed by decades of appeals and legal battles. Yet the images remain haunting. A man in his 80s strapped to a gurney. A blind, wheelchair-bound prisoner wheeled to his death. Frail defendants in their 90s brought before war crime tribunals. These are not pictures of public safety being restored. They are pictures of society insisting that justice, however delayed, will be delivered. From Walter Moody to Clarence Ray Allen, from elderly Nazi criminals to aging death row inmates still awaiting their fate, one lesson becomes crystal clear. Even in the 21st century, old age is no shield against the executioner. But this raises the final, most difficult question of all. Why? Why do societies persist in executing the elderly, long after the crimes were committed, long after the threat is gone? That's where we'll turn in our conclusion, Part 6, where we bring together the threads of history, philosophy, and morality to understand what these cases reveal about justice itself. From the philosophers of ancient Greece to the bombers of modern America, from elderly witches condemned by medieval villagers to gray-haired generals tried for war crimes, one lesson is constant. The death sentence recognizes no age. Throughout history, societies have executed the young, the strong, and the dangerous. But perhaps even more striking and unsettling is when the executioner comes for the old. Why? Why does justice persist even when the condemned can no longer harm anyone? What does it mean to take the final years of someone who has already lived through a lifetime? Executing an elderly person is rarely about public safety. A man in his 70s or 80s is unlikely to leap from prison and resume his crimes. Instead, these cases carry a deeper, more symbolic weight. In ancient times, executing an elder sent a message that no one was beyond the reach of the gods or the state. Socrates' death told Athens that even wisdom itself could not defy authority. In the medieval era, burning or beheading the old reinforced superstition and political power. An old woman at the stake reminded villagers that fear of the devil was stronger than pity. An aging noble at the block reminded rivals that treason never aged out. In the modern world, executing the elderly has become about delayed justice. Whether it is a Nazi war criminal tried decades later, or Walter Moody facing lethal injection at 83, the message is clear: time cannot erase guilt. In every era, the execution of the old has been less about practicality and more about principle. These stories force us to wrestle with a difficult moral question. Should justice ever yield to mercy simply because of age? Supporters of executing the elderly argue that justice must be consistent. To excuse someone because they are old risks undermining the system entirely. If the law is blind, it must remain blind to age as well. Victims deserve closure. For families who have waited decades, the sight of justice finally carried out, even on a frail, gray-haired prisoner, can bring a sense of peace. Accountability cannot expire. If someone has taken lives, betrayed nations, or committed atrocities, their years lived cannot outweigh the lives lost. Opponents argue that execution of the elderly is cruelty without purpose. A blind, wheelchair-bound prisoner poses no threat. Killing them is symbolic vengeance, not justice. Society gains nothing. Unlike in medieval times, there is no public spectacle, no deterrent effect in executing an old man in a closed chamber. Mercy reflects humanity. Sparing the old does not mean excusing their crimes. It means allowing natural death to finish what time has already begun. This tension defines every modern debate on the subject. The oldest death sentences of all time are not just about individuals. They are mirrors reflecting what each society valued most. Ancient Greece valued conformity over philosophy. Rome valued imperial power over wisdom. Medieval Europe valued superstition over compassion. Modern nations value accountability over age. And in each case, the decision to execute the elderly reveals a society unwilling to compromise on what it considered its highest principle, whether that was religion, monarchy, or law. As we close this journey, picture the faces of those who met their end at old age. Socrates, calmly drinking poison at 70. Seneca, the Roman philosopher, bleeding slowly in his 60s. A nameless old woman, accused of witchcraft, engulfed in flames in a German village. Sir Walter Raleigh, silver-haired, urging the executioner to strike. A Nazi officer, gray and bent, led to the gallows in Nuremberg. Walter Moody, blind and 83, strapped to a gurney in Alabama. Different eras, different crimes, different methods, but one unbroken thread. Age cannot erase guilt. So what do we take from this? Perhaps that death sentences, especially for the old, are about more than punishment. They are about storytelling. They tell victims' families that justice does not forget. They tell societies that no one escapes accountability. And they tell history that the rule of law, however flawed, will not allow time to wash away crime. But they also remind us of something darker, that humanity has always struggled with the balance between justice and mercy. That even in our most advanced courts, we sometimes choose vengeance over compassion. And that even the longest life can end not in peace, but under the shadow of the executioner. They remind us that justice is relentless, history is unforgiving, and age is never a guarantee of mercy. Whether in the courts of ancient Athens, the fires of medieval Europe, or the death chambers of modern America, the message echoes across centuries. When the law demands death, it does not ask your age. Subscribe for more in-depth true-life documentaries, and together, let's keep these stories alive.